Continuing on Chapter 17, Revolution and the Enlightenment. Today we will focus on Section 2, the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was a period in history when philosophers emphasized the use of reason as the best method of learning truth. The period of enlightenment began in the 1600s and lasted until the late 1700s. The Enlightenment is also called the Age of Reason or Age of Rationalism. Its leaders included several French philosophers, including René Descartes, Denis Diderot, Rousseau, and Voltaire, as well as the English philosopher John Locke. The leaders of the Enlightenment relied heavily on the scientific method with its emphasis on experimentation and careful observation. The period produced many important advances in such fields as anatomy, astronomy, chemistry, mathematics, and physics. Philosophers of the Enlightenment organized knowledge in encyclopedias and founded scientific institutes. The philosophers believed that scientific method could be applied to the study of human nature. They explored issues in education, law, philosophy, and politics, and attacked tyranny, social injustice, superstition, and ignorance. Many of their ideas were taken up as ideals of the American and French revolutions during the late 1700s. The Enlightenment was an 18th century philosophical movement of intellectuals who were greatly impressed with the achievements of the scientific revolution. One of the favorite words of these intellectuals was reason. By this, they meant the application of the scientific method to an understanding of all life. They hoped by that using the scientific method, they could make progress toward a better society than the one that they inherited. Reason, natural law, hope, progress. These were the common words to the thinkers of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was specifically influenced by the ideas of two 17th century Englishmen, Isaac Newton and John Locke. Yesterday we talked about Isaac Newton. Today we are going to talk about John Locke. John Locke was an English philosopher. His writings have influenced political science and philosophy. Locke's book, Two Treatises of Government, written in 1690, strongly influenced Thomas Jefferson in the writing of the Declaration of Independence. Locke believed that the universe contained three things: the minds, various types of bodies, and God. Bodies had two kinds of properties. One kind was mathematically measurable, such as the length and weight, and existed in the bodies themselves. The second kind was qualitative, such as sound and color. These properties were not in the bodies themselves, but they were simply powers that the bodies had to produce ideas of colors and sounds in the mind. According to Locke, a good life was a life of pleasure. Pleasure and pain were simple ideas that accompanied nearly all human experiences. Ethical action involved determining which act in a given situation would produce the greatest pleasure, and then performing that act. Locke also believed that God had established divine law. This law could be discovered by reason, and to disobey it was morally wrong. Locke thought that divine law and the pleasure principle were compatible. Locke believed that people by nature had certain rights and duties. These rights included liberty, life, and ownership of property. By liberty, Locke meant political equality. The tasks of any state was to protect people's rights. States inconvenience people in various ways. Therefore, the justification for a state's existence had to be found in its ability to protect human rights better than the individuals could do on their own. Locke declared that if a government did not adequately protect the rights of its citizens, they had the right to find other rulers. The intellectuals of the Enlightenment were known by the French name, philosophe, meaning philosopher. Not all philosophes were French, however. A few were French philosophers in strict senses of the term. They were writers, professors, economists, and above all, social reformers. They came chiefly from the nobility and the middle class. Most of the leaders of the Enlightenment were French, but even the French would have acknowledged that the English had provided the philosophical inspiration for the Enlightenment. It was definitely these French philosophies, however, who affected the intellectuals elsewhere and created a movement that influenced the entire Western world. The Enlightenment was truly an international movement. Montesquieu, Voltaire, and Diderot were three of the most famous French philosophers. Montesquieu was a French philosopher, and his major work, The Spirit of Laws, written in 1748, influenced the writings of many constitutions, including the Constitution of the United States. Montesquieu believed that laws underlie all things, human, natural, and divine. One of philosophy's major tasks was to discover these laws. It was difficult to study humanity because the laws governing human nature was complex. Yet Montesquieu believed that these laws could be found by empirical methods of investigation. Knowledge of the laws would ease all ills of society and improve life. Montesquieu said that there were three basic types of government, and he supported human freedom and opposed tyranny. He believed that all political liberty involved separating the legislative, executive, and judicial powers of government. He believed that liberty and respect for properly constituted law could exist together. Voltaire was one of the greatest figures of the Enlightenment. It was his pen name, Francis Marie Arouet, was known by Voltaire. Voltaire came from a prosperous middle-class family, and he wrote an almost endless stream of pamphlets, novels, plays, letters, essays, and histories, which brought him both fame and wealth. He was especially known for his criticism of Christianity and his strong belief in religious toleration. Throughout his life, Voltaire championed deism, an 18th century religious philosophy based on reason and natural law. Deism built on the idea of Newtonian world machine. In the deist view, a mechanic or a god had created the universe. To Voltaire and many other philosophies, the universe was like a clock. God, the clockmaker, had created it, set it in motion, and allowed it to run without his interference, according to its own natural laws. Diderot's work included fiction, drama, art, and literary criticism. He was a brilliant conversationalist. He spent much of his life compelling, editing, and writing the French Encyclopedia. Diderot strongly supported experimental methods in philosophy and science. He believed that nature was in a state of constant change and no permanently adequate interpretation of it was possible. Diderot was also a philosophical materialist, believing that thought developed from the movements and changes of matter. His views on this subject were vague, as were his religious opinions. At one time, he was an atheist. At another time, Diderot was also a deist, believing that God existed independently of the world and had no interest in it. But later, he suggested that all of nature was God. Throughout his life, Diderot remained dedicated to new ideas. Scottish philosopher Adam Smith has been viewed as one of the founders of modern social science of economics. He was interested in identifying the natural economic laws that governed human society. He maintained that if individuals were free to pursue their own economic self-interest, all society would ultimately benefit. The state then should not interfere in the free play of natural economic forces by imposing government regulations on economy. The state should leave the economy alone. The doctrine became known by its French name, laissez-faire, meaning to let people do what they want. The best statement of laissez-faire was made in 1776 by Adam Smith in his most famous work, The Wealth of Nations. Smith believed that the state should not interfere in economic matters. Indeed, Smith gave to government only three basic roles: protecting society from invasion, defending citizens from injustice, and keeping up certain public works, such as roads and the canals that the private individuals could not afford. Jean-Jacques Rousseau was a French philosopher. He was the most important writer of the Enlightenment. Rousseau's philosophy helped shape the political events that led to the French Revolution. His works have influenced education, literature, and politics. Rousseau criticized society in several essays. He believed that people are not social beings by nature. He stated that people living in a natural condition, isolated and without language, are kind and without motive or impulse to hurt one another. However, once they live together in society, people become evil. Society corrupts individuals by bringing out their inclination towards aggression and selfishness. In his famous work, The Social Contract, published in 1762, Rousseau presented his concept of the social contract. Through a social contract, the entire society agrees to be governed by its general will. Individuals who wish to instead follow their own self-interest must be forced to abide by the general will. This means nothing less than that they will be forced to be free, said Rousseau. Thus, liberty is achieved by being forced to follow what is best for the general will, because the general will represents what is best for the entire community. Mary Wollstonecraft was the founder of the modern European and American movement for women's rights. She was best known for her book, A Vindication of the Rights of Women, written in 1792. This book was one of the first to claim that women should have equality with men. Wollstonecraft said that men considered women morally and mentally inferior to themselves. She argued that women could live happy, creative lives if they had better educational opportunities. She based her book on the democratic principles of the French Revolution and on her own experiences. She was born in London and educated herself by studying books at home. For a brief period, she and her sisters ran a school. From this experience, she wrote Thoughts on the Education of Daughters. In this pamphlet, she criticized the cruel treatment of young girls that was common at the time. She also wrote other essays as well as stories and translations. Her daughter, Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, wrote the famous horror novel Frankenstein, written in 1818. Of great importance to the Enlightenment was the spread of its ideas to the illiterate elite of the European society. Especially noticeable in the 18th century was the growth of both publishing and reading public. The number of titles issued each year by the French publishers rose from 300 in 1750 to about 1,600 in the 1780s. Books had previously been aimed at small groups of the educated elite. Now many books were directed at new reading public of the middle classes, which included women and urban artisans. An important aspect of the growing publishing and reading in the 18th century was the development of magazines for the general public. In Great Britain, an important center for the news magazines, 25 periodicals were published in 1700 and 103 in 1760 and 158 in 1780. Along with magazines came daily newspapers. The first was printed in London in 1702. Newspapers were relatively cheap and were even provided free in many coffee houses. Salon refers to a type of room and to certain activities that take place in the room. The word salon comes from the old French word salle, which means great hall. Originally, a salon was a large reception room in a palace. It provided an impressive setting for entertaining guests or meeting the public. Some salons were 2-story high with an arched ceiling and several windows. Many salons had elaborate sculptured and painted decorations on the wall. During the 1600s and 1700s, artists in the French Royal Academy held exhibitions of their work in the Salon Carré in the Louvre Palace in Paris. These exhibits became known as salon. The term still means annual exhibition of work and living artists. Because the Louvre was the only public art in Paris, it established an official approved style of art. Many artists protested the salon's control over the public taste. The term salon can also mean a gathering of fashionable people, which is what it means for the Enlightenment. During the 1700s, wealthy Parisians built townhouses with elegantly decorated salons. Their hostess usually invited writers, philosophers, and politicians, as well as aristocrats. These French salons became famous for their brilliant conversation. The women that hosted the salons found themselves in a position to sway political opinion and influence literary and artistic taste. Although many philosophies attacked the Christian churches, most Europeans in the 18th century were still Christians. Many people also sought a deeper personal devotion with God. One of these people was John Wesley, the founder of Methodism. Wesley claimed that the gift of God's grace assured him of salvation. He preached an open mass to the masses in open fields. He appealed especially to the lower classes. He tried, he said, to lower religion to the level of the lowest people's capacities. Wesley's powerful sermons often caused people to have conversion experiences. Many of these converts joined Methodist societies in which they helped others do good works. In this way, Methodism gave the lower and middle classes in English society a sense of purpose and community. The Methodists stressed the importance of hard work and encouraged behaviors that led to spiritual contentment, which took the place of political equality. After Wesley's death, Methodism became a separate Protestant group known as Methodists. Methodism proved that the need for spiritual experience had not been eliminated by the 18th century search for reason.
Made with Doodlecast Pro.